Well, hey there. My name is Trevor Sullivan. I am a solutions architect at StratusGrid. And with me today, I've got one of our lead cloud engineers, Matt Barlow. And the topic for discussion today is going to be an open source technology called Backstage. So, welcome, Matt. Do you want to give a brief introduction to yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Trevor. I'm really happy to be here. Like you said, my name is Matt Barlow. I work for StratusGrid. StratusGrid is an AWS Premier Partner. I'm also an AWS Ambassador. So I work with basically large engineering or organizations. I'm a cloud infrastructure lead. StratusGrid does consulting for AWS, and we also do professional services, and we're a product company as well. So kind of get a lot of exposure, a lot of utilization with AWS, and some of the challenges that people face when operating at scale.
Awesome, awesome. So, just something folks might not know about our company is that we actually just several weeks ago, as of this recording, achieved our premier consulting partner status with AWS. We were advanced tier consulting partner before, so that's brand new. Premier is kind of the highest tier of consulting partner, and we do a lot of enterprise work. So, we'd love to talk to you if you're interested in any kind of AWS consulting services. So, moving on to the topic for our discussion today, what is Backstage? I'm not really personally familiar with Backstage. I mean, I've seen the GitHub project page for it. I've done a little bit of reading about it in the documentation, which seems to be pretty solid. But you've got a lot more hands-on experience with it. I know you've built some code around deploying it. So why don't you tell us about what Backstage is and what interests you in it?
Absolutely. So over the past several years, you've seen, especially when you have like maybe five or more engineering teams, that kind of moving from away from a centralized like DevOps type infrastructure management model to more of a platform engineering. And Backstage, I think, is really attractive to organizations that are going through that change, because it enables you to have a platform team that's providing a portal basically for developers to be able to create new services and to have an inventory of all the software that you're creating and to build things in a consistent way. So Backstage, at its core, it's a React application. It's also part of the CNCF, and it was developed by Spotify and released as open source. So what you can do as as a platform or an infrastructure team is you can create a portal that as and the developers and the individual service delivery teams are really the users of it, the primary users. So you can use templates, so you can create different templates for different types of software that your company creates, and they just need to log into the portal and basically click a button to create a new project. And then from there, Backstage will create Git repos, so GitHub or Bitbucket or GitLab, and it will configure all based on their form input. It will template out the repository with all the kind of scaffolding and code that they need to be able to get started quickly. So there's more that you can do in terms of automating new project creation, but that's really one of the core strengths of Backstage. So the other feature of it that I kind of referenced is the software catalog. So it gives you a view into all the software that's being created, and sorry. It gives you a view into all the software that's being created and all the relationships between them. So the software catalog is also super powerful.
Awesome. That sounds like it has a lot of rich functionality. Can you talk a little bit more about what functions it offers to development teams around things like documentation or monitoring? Or, as you mentioned, it's kind of a software catalog. So, if I'm building a new service at my company and I need some capability from some other service, I need to find out, is this something I have to build myself, or does this already exist and I can just hook into that existing functionality from another internal service? So what kind of capabilities? How do I search? How do I look through documentation for other services that other teams are developing?
Sure, that's a great question. So in Backstage, when you browse the catalog, you'll see all the software that's created. Now, Backstage uses something called entities. Entities are individual components and other types of resources that exist in the software catalog. So within like the software component entity, you can have, for example, an API service, a library, or a website, and what you're able to do then is for the pages that get presented are going to be different for each type. So, for example, with a API service, Backstage has open API integration. So you'll be able to, filter down and see all the different APIs that are in development at your company and be able to click on each one and have the spec files, like a nice view of the Swagger open API documentation visible to you, so that you can see what routes are available. And also it has integration with something called Tech Docs, so it can surface all the documentation for your projects. And that's really one of the core strengths of Backstage, is that if you have several engineering teams, you're probably very focused on what you're building, but you don't have a lot of quick access to gather context on other services that are being created by other teams. So Backstage enables you to browse the catalog quickly and find the most important information about those projects. It also it also supports third-party plugins. So if you're using Datadog, for example, there's a Datadog plugin, so you can have like the most important dashboards visible in Backstage. So you have the dashboards, documentation, API specs, and other information that you need to quickly gather context about a service.
Awesome. So you mentioned TechDocs integration. What is TechDocs and what do I need to know about it when I'm developing documentation for my service? How does that kind of help me?
Sure. So the TechDocs integration in Backstage is basically a plugin that will take Markdown files from your GitHub repository and present them in a view within Backstage that's easy to navigate. So it can include like table of contents and allow you to narrow down into different sections of the documentation. So it's you can think of it as basically something that's you're building a nice document viewer from just raw Markdown files.
Awesome. That sounds really helpful. Probably not too dissimilar from writing markdown files in GitHub where they just render the page in line. Is that right?
Right, but it does also have other plugins available. So for example, like displaying mermaid diagrams and other things that you might not get just with a default kind of Markdown parser.
Awesome. So for some folks who may not be familiar with Mermaid, what is Mermaid and how does that help me write better quality documentation for my services?
So Mermaid is basically a way to render diagrams based off of JavaScript. So it's just when you're writing documentation, it's a way to store your diagrams in code.
Awesome. So you can kind of version control your diagrams because they're not raster images like PNG or JPEG files. They're actually just code.
100%, yeah.
Awesome. That sounds really powerful. So how did you first hear about Backstage? Like where did you discover it and what kind of intrigued you about it?
So previously, we were working with customers that had, multiple engineering teams, and we wanted a way to standardize the creation of serverless projects. So what we built was something in Terraform that enabled you to like submit a pull request and put in your service name, and then Terraform would go out and create the GitHub repos and put the settings in and add some kind of scaffolding to them, which worked fine for a while, but it's still like a manual ops-driven approach. And when I was talking about with this with some people at a Google Cloud, they had mentioned Backstage, and and then we started investigating it, and since then it's gained a lot of popularity. Backstage is a nicer interface than just adding a service name to a file and submitting a pull request. And it also has all the other features like the catalog, so tracking the relationships between different software projects. You can say that this service is a dependency of another service. You can combine multiple services into something called a system. So it has really rich kind of relationship tracking as well. But that's how I first heard about it, and we started evaluating it, and very quickly, well, I would say within about a year, we had over 100 services, new services and software projects provisioned through Backstage.
Awesome. Sounds like a really cool tool. And is Backstage something that I would want to use in a multi-cloud environment? You just mentioned in your last answer a Google Cloud platform, and of course, we're an AWS Premier partner, and of course, Microsoft Azure is probably one of the top three largest cloud vendors out there: Azure, GCP, and AWS. So if I'm using multi-cloud, a little bit of infrastructure in each of those cloud vendors, or maybe some service teams prefer one cloud over the other just due to skill levels and familiarity. Is Backstage something that would still benefit me, or do I really just need to focus on one cloud platform?
Backstage does well in a multi-cloud environment. It doesn't have any direct ties to infrastructure unless you're enabling plugins for those types of services. But it could give you a view of all your services, and it enables you to, since you can store metadata about each service, you can store data about what cloud it is provisioned on, and then you can use plugins to basically surface information about that cloud specifically. So, for example, Backstage has a new AWS ECS plugin that shows you information about ECS clusters and ECS services. So within your Backstage, the way that it basically captures information about all of your services is pretty brilliant. It pulls in information from a catalog info file that lives in the GitHub, or in the Git repository. So in your catalog file, you can add a key for cloud provider and or service type and put ECS, and then the plugin will only display information about ECS if that metadata exists on the service. So you could do the same thing with other clouds as well, and make use of the plugins that other cloud providers give you.
Awesome. And are those built in out of the box, or do I have to install plugins to talk to those different cloud providers?
So Backstage has a few plugins installed out of the box. I mean, technically, like the software catalog itself is a plugin, and the scaffolder is a plugin. And those are the core functionality of Backstage. So you're gonna get those as soon as you provision it. In terms of like other third parties, then you will need to install those yourself. So you do need to be familiar with TypeScript, and have some kind of knowledge of how React applications and Yarn works in order to manage Backstage. But they're essentially npm plugins, and you're really going to want to customize Backstage according to the third-party vendors and stuff that you use.
Awesome. What are some other plugins that I might want to install after I set up Backstage for the first time? Are there any additional plugins? You mentioned Datadog earlier for embedding dashboards inside of my service documentation page with tech docs, but what other kinds of plugins might I be interested in using?
I would say that either like Opsgenie or PagerDuty for incident management is helpful. Also, like CI/CD plugins are extremely beneficial. So whether you're using Circle CI or GitHub Actions or Code Deploy, there are Backstage plugins for all of those, and those are going to surface a lot of important information regarding quickly coming to terms with how a service is deployed currently.
Awesome. So it sounds like these plugins are predominantly used for kind of surfacing information or exposing reporting type data into your service documentation. Are there any capabilities where I can actually affect change in those platforms as well? For example, if I want to click a button and abort the execution of a CI/CD pipeline, or are these plugins only for kind of surfacing report level information, kind of read only?
It varies, but excuse me, it varies, but I wouldn't think of Backstage as really a place where you interact directly with resources in another environment. It's more for reporting and surfacing visible information, and then you click through when you want to find more detail. So going back like for the PagerDuty example, you might see that there's an incident, but if you want to dig into the like the details of it, then you're gonna in Backstage you'll have a link and you'll click through to the vendor's dashboard to basically do more work.
Okay, so if you deploy, for example, a Fargate container for your service or an ECS cluster or maybe a CloudWatch dashboard, you can just link to that from inside of your tech docs documentation, but you're not necessarily making changes, like maybe changing the scaling policy for your ECS cluster services or something like that, right? You'd still do that in the actual vendor's console.
That's correct, and you don't even need to keep like the URLs and tech docs or anything like that because you'll be able to through the plugin itself. So, for example, if you have the Datadog integration, you can click the graph and be taken directly to the Datadog console to investigate in more detail.
Okay, awesome. What about for like vulnerability scanning? If I want to perform vulnerability scans and kind of get potential vulnerability data about my service or directly inside of Backstage, is there any plugins that help me to accomplish that?
Yes, so the Sneak plugin works well for that. So when you are looking at like a software component or a service, for example, on the main page for that service, you can have different widgets for your different integrations. So you might have like a widget for CI/CD, a Datadog graph, and then a Sneak score, an overall score. And then the Sneak plugin in particular also allows you to drill down and to see quite a bit of detail about the what vulnerabilities exist.
Okay. Are there any other kind of vulnerability scanner type integrations in addition to Sneak? Because if I recall correctly, Sneak is kind of geared towards container workloads and scanning the kind of bill of materials inside of those container images. Is that right?
Sneak scans the GitHub repositories for vulnerabilities, so it does static analysis.
Okay, on your code directly, so it's not necessarily
Hmm.
looking at container images, it's just looking at your actual code and looking for potential vulnerabilities in there and your dependencies?
Yep, exactly.
Okay, awesome.
There may
So
be other plugins available as well, but that's the only one that I have experience with.
okay. So if I wanna run Backstage, this is an open source project, right? And so this is not a managed service. This is something that if I wanna take advantage of the functionality that Backstage provides, I'm gonna have to deploy that into my own environment, right? So where can I or should I run Backstage if I want to deploy it?
Sure. So Backstage, your configuration is going to be different whether you're running it locally or running it in dev or in prod. But if you just want to get Backstage up and running and kind of evaluate it, you can run it locally easily by just cloning the Backstage repository and running yarn dev. And that will spin up basically the back end and the front end for Backstage in containers locally, and you'll be able to browse it over a local URL with authentication disabled. Backstage will merge your configurations, so you can have kind of a default app config, and then you can have one for dev and one for prod. When the service is deployed to a real like cloud environment, then you're going to want to enable like Postgres, an external Postgres server, probably enable caching with Redis, and um, and then you'll be able to access it that way. But you can have different configurations for dev, for prod, and for local, all configured within the app config files. So like I said, like in your local development, authentication will be disabled. And then when you deploy it into a cloud environment, you're going to want to configure authentication either with Okta or with GitHub. And for example, and you're also going to want to enable the catalog, which will connect to a GitHub organization. So that's the way that I've configured it, where we have a GitHub application. Backstage will spin up and it will browse the GitHub organization for repositories with catalog files and automatically add those to the catalog.
Awesome. So I can just scan those repositories. It'll look for that kind of configuration file with a special name, I presume, at the root of the repository. And then it'll basically just make those templates available for you to deploy from.
Exactly, yeah.
Awesome.
So,
So how do you go about deploying Backstage? Do you have any helper tools or modules that kind of simplify the deployment process on AWS?
for AWS, I absolutely do. I have a walkthrough that will that includes Terraform and also the Backstage application itself, and it will enable you to spin up Backstage running on AWS quickly. It builds it on ECS as an ECS service, and that will be enough to basically start evaluating it running in a cloud environment. And then you'd want to customize it to actually enable the GitHub integration as well as the authentication.
Awesome. And I'm actually just going to bring up that repository really quick here for everybody to take a look at. So if you go out to github.com/stratusgrid/backstage AWS walkthrough, you can find this repository out here. Matt Barlow developed this, and this just is a helper for you to go ahead and deploy a Backstage environment into AWS. So this is a really helpful project, and huge thanks to Matt Barlow for putting this project together and making Backstage a lot easier to adopt. So what are the next steps? If I like this idea of a service catalog and being able to browse different people's services and kind of document my service and kind of market it internally to other service teams that might want to take advantage of my service, what should I do? Should I spin it up locally like you recommended and just play around with it locally? Should I deploy it into the cloud and connect it to Okta and go through all that? What kind of evaluation do I need to do, not just for myself, but also for the entire organization? If there's
Mhm.
30, 40, 50 different development teams, how do I kind of sell it to them and get them bought in to the idea of adopting this tool?
Good question. So when you're first, what I would recommend is if you're introducing this within like a larger size company, when you want to start evaluating and testing things, you're going to want to deploy it onto a cloud like AWS and integrate it with a GitHub organization. Now, you may want to create a test organization or a POC organization first, because your initial experimentation is going to be writing templates, and you're going to be wanting to write templates, create new projects, and you may not want to be cluttering up the production GitHub organization for your company. So that's the approach that I would take, is to create a POC organization, create the GitHub application, use GitHub authentication in the beginning is the easiest to configure. And what that will do is anybody that's a member of that organization will be able to access Backstage. Backstage will ingest the users and the teams from GitHub, and you can start creating new projects and ensure that everything looks as you want it. And then when you're ready, then you switch it over to the production organization. Or you could leave a staging environment or a dev environment that's connected to the test org, and then spin up Backstage in production, modify the app config like I was talking about so that production connects to a different organization than the lower environments. And then that will be your production instance of Backstage. In terms of selling it to the rest of the engineering organization, it kind of sells itself, but it also kind of depends on what does your existing process look like for creating new projects. Because I've been places where if a team wants to start a new coding on a new project, that it can take weeks or months, to create Jira tickets, get them prioritized into a sprint for a DevOps team, get all of the CI/CD and repositories configured. The selling point of Backstage is that you're up and running immediately. So if you have an idea for a new project that you want to work on, you can create it through Backstage. And if CI/CD is configured correctly, like for example, if you're using GitHub Actions, everything can be automated end to end, and including infrastructure provisioning. And This is just a really smooth workflow for creating new services, and I think that you'll find that people want to use it for that purpose.
Now, you might hear from some people that AWS has a service known as Service Catalog, right? And this is a templating service, not too dissimilar from what you've described with Backstage, but I can develop a cloud formation template that defines a bunch of infrastructure, maybe a VPC, some EC2 instances, DynamoDB tables, RDS instances, whatever I need for to build my application. But what differentiates Backstage compared to a service like Service Catalog? What are some of the gaps that I might see if I just use Service Catalog versus getting all this functionality in Backstage?
So with Backstage, I think that the focus is not really on infrastructure, although you can automate infrastructure provisioning, but it's more with the GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab integration, and so I think that's where you're going to see kind of the biggest differentiator with it, and then as well as like the third-party plugins that I don't think that you would get through Service Catalog.
Or documentation, for example, and that whole discovery element of other services. The Service Catalog, I don't believe, has that kind of functionality built in either, does it?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of, and also the fact that it's agnostic to the cloud provider as well as the underlying infrastructure that you're running, and then also the relationship tracking, like I mentioned earlier, is really powerful too in Backstage. The ability to say like that these services depend on other services. There's one other use case for Backstage that has been really helpful for us, which is that Backstage not only can create new repositories, but it can create pull requests on existing repositories. And that's been really helpful, for example, as we have migrated services from EC2 to ECS and from using one infrastructure as code tool to another. What we can do is log into Backstage, you fill out a form, and Backstage will use that to create a pull request on an existing repository, a draft PR, with the scaffolded content so that you can accelerate your migration process. So, for example, it may have a Docker file. It may create other infrastructure import scripts and other things that can help you with the migration.
Awesome. That sounds like a really cool tool. So, what would you encourage people to do as a next step? Should they just go out to GitHub and deploy your Terraform template and start poking around?
I think that would be a great first step. I mean, first I would probably just run it locally, like clone the official repository and run it locally, so you can get familiar with what it looks like and what you can do with it. And I will also say, kind of caution that I think that Backstage is really it's really helpful when you have a lot of repositories, a lot of several teams, and um, but it does require maintenance, right? And it does require understanding of React and TypeScript, especially when it comes to upgrades. So I would say that like if you're just at a smaller company where you're kind of the lone person that's responsible for configuring CI/CD and infrastructure, that Backstage probably wouldn't offer much benefit. But if you're at a larger organization where you have different teams that are working on different projects, and your process for creating new projects can take a long time, then Backstage can be super helpful.
Awesome. And you also have a blog post that talks more about Backstage on a Stratusgrid or a Stratusgrid company blog. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So that page is more on the infrastructure side. So since Backstage creates a GitHub repository for you, but by default, it's not going to provision any infrastructure. So the blog post walks you through how you can automate the creation of a new project and the infrastructure provisioning as well. So the way that you can do that is by using the Terraform provider for Backstage. So you can use the Terraform provider um, to query the Backstage API to pull all of your services of a given type, for example, like maybe all of your React services get deployed with a certain standard set of infrastructure. All of your API services are deployed, with a similar infrastructure. Then you can use the Terraform provider to pull those lists and basically loop through them and provision infrastructure for them.
Awesome. Well, Backstage sounds like a really exciting tool, Matt. I certainly appreciate the blog post you wrote on it, as well as the GitHub repository that simplifies the deployment of Backstage on AWS. I think that'll be really helpful and get people up to speed on Backstage much more quickly than having to kind of manually read through the documentation and figure out all those nitty gritty details for themselves. So thanks so much for joining us, Matt. Really appreciate your insights on Backstage, and we would encourage you to check out our Stratus Grid blog for more AWS and cloud-related topics going forward. We're always publishing new content out there, and also make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Leave a comment down below as well so that we can learn about what's interesting to you. If there's some other tools out in the ecosystem that you would like to share with the rest of the community, we would love to hear that, and we'd love to hear what you think about Backstage. So make sure you leave a comment down below. Thanks so much again, Matt, for joining us, and we'll see you in the next video.
Thank you, Trevor.